My landlord walked into our courtroom, smiling with a tablet full of fake evidence, certain she had already won, until the judge asked her one question she could never answer. My landlord walked into that courthouse holding a tablet against her chest, like it was a trophy she'd already been handed. She was smiling, not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. The kind of smile people wear when they think a fight is already over before it starts. I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 4B with my lawyer, a compact, unhurried man named Paul Renner, and I watched her come toward us, heels clicking on the tile, her own lawyer trailing half a step behind her, carrying a leather folder thick enough to be a phone book. "Morning, Daniel," she said, like we were old friends who happened to run into each other buying coffee. "You look tired." I didn't answer. Paul put a hand lightly on my arm and steered me toward our bench along the wall. Her lawyer, a tall, sharp-suited man named Grant Feld, didn't bother with small talk. He walked straight up and held out a stack of papers, still wearing the same easy smile his client wore. "We filed a countersuit this morning," he said. "Your client owes my client $7,000 in damages." Paul's face went pale as he flipped through the pages, eyes moving fast, line by line. Something tightened behind his jaw. "She's claiming you put dozens of holes in the walls," he said quietly, not looking up. "She says she has video evidence." I stared at him. "That's impossible. I barely unpacked before she threw me out." Across the hallway, Diane Voss stood with her arms crossed, watching us absorb the hit. She wasn't hiding her satisfaction. She looked like a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up to reality. 4 months earlier, I had walked into that same house after a 10-hour shift and found her standing in my bedroom, elbow deep in my closet, throwing my clothes onto the floor like she owned every square inch of my life. It was the 5th time she'd let herself in. I had lived there 3 weeks. I didn't know yet, standing in that courthouse hallway holding a stack of papers accusing me of destroying a house I'd barely touched, that everything between that night and this one had been building toward a single question a judge was about to ask her. A question that would end everything, for both of us, in a way neither of us saw coming. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back to the beginning, and to every warning sign I talked myself out of. I was 27 years old, and 214 Larkspur Lane was the first place I'd ever rented on my own. Before that, I'd shared a 2-bedroom apartment with a college friend for 4 years, splitting rent, splitting groceries, never quite feeling like the space was mine. When my friend got engaged and moved out that January, I decided it was time. I'd saved $11,000 working shift supervisor hours at Fenmore Distribution, a logistics warehouse on the east side of Dayton, and I wanted, for once, a door that only I had a key to. I found the listing in late February. A small brick house, 2 bedrooms, a detached garage, a patchy but usable backyard, listed at $950 a month. The landlord's name on the listing was Diane Voss. I called the number, and she picked up on the second ring, warm and businesslike, and we set up a walkthrough for that Saturday. She was 58 years old, silver blonde hair always pulled back tight, the kind of woman who wore blazers to walk her own dog. She told me during the walkthrough that she and her late husband, Walter, had built up a small portfolio of 6 rental properties over almost 30 years of marriage. Walter had died 2 years earlier, heart attack, 61 years old, and Diane had taken over managing every property herself. "I don't use a management company," she told me, standing in the empty living room, running a hand along the windowsill like she was checking for dust. "Walter and I built this ourselves. I like to know exactly what's happening in my own houses." At the time, I thought that sounded diligent, careful. Later, I would understand it meant something closer to obsessive. There were framed photographs still hanging in the hallway during that first walkthrough, left over from whatever previous arrangement she'd had with the house. A younger Diane and a heavy-set, smiling man I assumed was Walter, standing in front of the same brick facade with a real estate sign at their feet, dated in faded marker on the back, 1997. She caught me looking at it and softened in a way I hadn't seen from her yet. "That was the day we closed on this one," she said. "Our 3rd property. Walter always said this street reminded him of the one he grew up on." She took the photo down before I moved in, along with the others, but she mentioned it again during our final walkthrough, almost wistfully, like she was handing me something more than just a set of keys. "Take care of it," she said. It meant a lot to him. I told her I would, and at the time I meant it sincerely. I liked her, honestly, during those first 2 weeks. She brought over a loaf of banana bread the Sunday after I moved in, still warm, wrapped in foil, and stood on my porch for 20 minutes telling me about the neighborhood, which houses on the street had good trick-or-treat turnout in October, which neighbor to ask if I ever needed a ladder. It felt, briefly, like the kind of relationship you hope for with a landlord. Not close exactly, but human, neighborly. I want to be clear about that, because it makes what came after harder to explain, not easier. She wasn't a stranger who turned out to be cruel from day one. She was someone who seemed genuinely to care, right up until the moment caring became a justification for control. I signed the lease on March 2nd, $950 a month, first and last, plus a $1,200 security deposit, 12-month term. I moved in on March 9th with my brother Marcus's help, hauling boxes and a secondhand couch up the porch steps, while Diane hovered near the driveway. "Just checking in," she said, though nobody had asked her to. Marcus was 31 21, a mechanic at a shop off Wilmington Pike, and he'd been the one who talked me into finally moving out on my own. He stood in the kitchen that first night, looking around at the bare walls and said, "This is a good move, man. Feels like yours." When it did feel like mine, for about 11 days. There was a woman at my warehouse, Jenna Ruiz, who worked the same shift as me on the loading floor. When I mentioned during a break that I'd just signed a lease on Larkspur Lane, her face did something complicated. "Diane Voss?" she asked. "Silver hair, drives the gray Buick?" I told her yes, and asked how she knew. "My cousin Priya rented from her 2 years ago," Jenna said. "Different house over on Delridge. She said Diane used to let herself in whenever she felt like it. Said it was her house, so the rules didn't really apply to her." I remember laughing it off. I told Jenna every landlord probably had a story like that attached to them somewhere, and mine had seemed perfectly nice at the walkthrough. Jenna shrugged and said she just wanted me to know, and we moved on to talking about something else. There was one more thing, small enough that I didn't think about it again until much later. On my second day in the house, while I was hanging clothes in the bedroom closet, I noticed a small white plastic device tucked into the corner above the closet door frame, half hidden behind the trim. It had a tiny black lens-like dot on the front. I assumed it was an old smoke detector, maybe left over from a previous alarm system Walter had installed years ago. I texted Diane a photo and asked if it still worked. "Oh, that old thing," she wrote back. "Ignore it, not connected to anything anymore." I believed her. Why wouldn't I? It was such a small, unremarkable detail in a house full of them, and I had boxes to unpack and a job that started at 6 in the morning. The first real sign of trouble came 11 days after I moved in, on a Wednesday evening in late March. I got home from a long shift, keys already in hand, and found the front door unlocked. I remember my stomach dropping, thinking I'd forgotten to lock it that morning. Then I heard movement upstairs and I froze in the doorway. I went up the stairs slow and there she was, Diane Voss, standing in my bedroom, digging through my closet, pulling shirts off hangers and letting them drop onto the floor like she was searching for something specific. Dresser drawers hung open. My nightstand had been moved 6 inches from the wall. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't even glance up. "Checking for unauthorized storage." I told her as calmly as I could manage, with my heart still hammering from the shock of finding a stranger in my room, that she needed 24 hours notice before entering. It was written into the lease, Section 9, Clause C. I'd read it twice before signing. She laughed, actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "This is my property. I don't need permission to walk through my own house." That was the first time I heard that phrase from her. It would not be the last. I guided her toward the door that night, hands shaking slightly, and once she was gone, I sat on my bed for a long time before I did anything else. Then I took a photo of the lease clause and texted it to her, along with a message asking her to please respect the notice requirement going forward. She replied within the hour, "I'm sorry, you're right. This won't happen again. I got carried away. I still think of this place as Walter's and mine, if that makes sense. I'll do better." I remember reading that message twice and feeling something in my chest loosen. It sounded human. It sounded like an honest mistake from a grieving widow who was still learning where the line was between her house and mine. I told Marcus about it that weekend, and he said, cautiously, that it was a good sign she'd apologized so quickly. Neither of us knew yet that an apology from Diane Voss functioned less like an ending and more like a reset button, one she pressed every single time, right before she did it again. A full week of peace followed. I started to relax again. I hung the last of my pictures, bought a small grill for the backyard, invited Marcus over for the game on a Sunday. For 7 days, the house felt like mine again. Then, the following Wednesday, I came home from my shift and noticed the living room felt wrong before I could say exactly why. It took me a second to place it. My couch had been moved 3 feet to the left. The armchair was angled toward the window instead of the TV. A folding table I kept near the door was gone entirely, dragged out to the garage. I called her immediately. She picked up on the first ring like she'd been expecting it. "I had someone come check the water heater," she said, before I'd even finished asking what happened. "The furniture was in the way. I had it moved so they could access the closet panel. You didn't tell me anyone was coming. It was an emergency inspection, Daniel. Water heaters can flood a whole basement if they're not caught early. Would you have preferred I let it flood?" I told her I would have preferred a text. Any text. Even one sent 5 minutes before she walked in. "You're being dramatic," she said, her voice shifting, cooler now. "Nothing was damaged. I don't understand why you're making this into something." That was the second time I heard a version of a phrase that would become familiar. Not this time, not exactly, but close enough. "I'm not doing anything wrong. You're the one overreacting." I hung up feeling strange, like I'd somehow ended up apologizing in my head for being upset about a stranger rearranging my living room. I texted her again that night, calmer, laying out the lease clause once more, asking that going forward she text me before any entry, planned or emergency, except in cases of genuine danger like fire or flooding already in progress. She agreed. She always agreed. Words came easily to Diane Voss. It was the space between her words and her behavior that kept collapsing. "You're right. I should have texted," she wrote. "I get so used to thinking of these houses as extensions of myself that I forget other people live inside them now. I'll be better." I showed that message to Marcus over dinner that Sunday, half looking for reassurance, half already suspecting I wasn't going to get it. He read it twice, handed my phone back and said, "That's a nice sentence. It's not an apology, though. Watch what she actually does next, not what she writes." I told him I would. I meant it, and I even believed for a few days that I was doing exactly that. It's a strange thing, watching for a pattern while still hoping, against the evidence accumulating in front of you, that this particular pattern might break in your favor. The third incident happened 8 days later, and this one cut differently, because it wasn't about the house at all. It was about me. I came home on a Thursday to find my mail sitting on the kitchen counter instead of the mailbox, already opened. Diane called that same evening, her tone light and conversational, like she was catching up with an old friend rather than confessing to a federal offense. "I brought your mail in for you," she said. "Saw a letter from a collections agency in there. Everything okay?" My stomach dropped. There had been a $600 medical bill from an ER visit 2 years earlier that had slipped through the cracks during a rough stretch after a layoff, and it had ended up with a collections agency chasing it. It was resolved now, mostly a payment plan I was 3 months into. It was also none of her business, and she had opened an envelope addressed to me to find out about it. "You opened my mail," I said. "I didn't mean to pry. I just want to make sure my tenants are financially stable. You should really be more careful with money if you want to keep renting from me, Daniel. I can't have someone falling behind." I told her, as evenly as I could, that opening a tenant's mail was a federal crime, and that my finances were not something she had any right to review unless I was actually behind on rent, which I was not once, not by a single day. "I was trying to help," she said, and her voice took on an injured note I would come to recognize instantly in the months ahead. "You don't have to be so hostile about it. I've had tenants who would appreciate someone looking out for them." I didn't sleep well that night, not because of the bill, which I could handle, but because of the sensation that someone had reached into a part of my life I hadn't shown her and was now using it as leverage, gently, almost affectionately, the way you'd hold something over a friend rather than a stranger. I texted her the next morning, short and firm this time. "Please do not open my mail again, under any circumstance." "Understood," she wrote back. "I only ever want what's best for this house and the people in it." I brought it up again a few days later, in person this time, when I ran into her at the mailbox at the end of the driveway. I told her I appreciated that she felt protective of the property, but that protectiveness couldn't extend to my finances, my mail, or anything else that lived inside my own life rather than inside her walls. She nodded along while I spoke, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You know," she said once I'd finished, "Walter and I never had this kind of friction with our tenants. People used to appreciate that we paid attention. I suppose things are different now. Everyone wants so much distance." It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a small, practiced sort of guilt, offered sideways, designed to make me feel like the demanding one for wanting a boundary most people would consider baseline decency. I remember standing there at the mailbox, genuinely unsure for a second whether I'd overreacted, before catching myself and recognizing the feeling for what it was. That was the shape her control kept taking, not force, redirection. Every time I named a problem, she found a way to make the problem sound like something wrong with me instead. The fourth incident cost me $350, and it was the first time I truly understood how careless she could be with things that weren't hers to be careless with. I came home from work on a Tuesday in mid-April to find the front door standing wide open, not unlocked, open, swung all the way back against the wall, like someone had walked out in a hurry and simply forgotten. My garage, which I'd left closed and locked that morning, stood open too, the door raised halfway. My bike, a secondhand aluminum frame road bike I'd bought for $350 the year before, was gone. I called Diane immediately, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. She answered casually, background noise behind her, like she was in the middle of running errands. "Oh, I stopped by to drop off a new air filter for the furnace," she said. "I must have forgotten to shut the door all the way behind me. I'm sorry about that. My bike is gone," I said. "Someone walked into an open house and took it." There was a pause, just a beat too long. "Well, I can't really be held responsible for what someone else did, Daniel. That's not really a landlord issue. That's more of a homeowner's insurance question on your end, don't you think?" I stood in my driveway, keys still in my hand, and felt something in me go very quiet and very still. It wasn't a flood of anger. It was colder than that. It was the specific, dawning realization that she had walked into my house without telling me, left it unsecured, cost me $350, and was now explaining to me, calmly, why that was somehow my problem to solve. I called Marcus that night and told him everything. The closet, the furniture, the mail, the bike. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Dude," he finally said, "this isn't landlord stuff anymore. This is a pattern." I told him I knew. I told him I was going to document everything from that point forward. Every text, every incident, every date. I didn't know yet how much I would need it. Diane texted me the next morning, unprompted. "I'm sorry about the door. I truly am. I know I've been in and out more than I should be. I promise, genuinely, this won't happen again. You've been a good tenant and I don't want to lose you over my own carelessness." I wanted to believe her. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who weren't there. It wasn't naivety, exactly. It was the simple, human hope that a person who apologizes that fluently, that convincingly, 4 times in a row, might actually mean it the 5th time. She did not mean it the 5th time. 9 days after the bike disappeared on a Thursday afternoon, my key wouldn't turn in the front door lock. I stood on the porch for a full minute assuming I'd grabbed the wrong key off my ring, checking it twice before it landed on me that the lock itself had been changed. I walked around to the side gate and into the backyard, and that's where I saw it. Everything I owned, sitting on the curb at the end of the driveway. My television, screen facing up to the sky. My clothes stuffed into black trash bags, some of them split open, sleeves and pant legs spilling onto the grass. My dishes, still wrapped in the newspaper I'd packed them in a month earlier, stacked in a cardboard box gone soft from morning dew. My mattress leaned against the mailbox post like discarded furniture on trash day. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. "I'm keeping your deposit for early termination," the text read. "You have 1 hour to remove your things." I stood on that sidewalk staring at everything I owned stacked like garbage at the curb of a house I still had 8 months left on a signed lease for, and for a second I genuinely could not breathe. A neighbor 2 doors down peeked through her curtains, watching, and then let the curtain fall back into place. Nobody came outside. Nobody asked if I was okay. I called Marcus, and he came within 20 minutes with his truck, and together, mostly in silence, we loaded what hadn't already been damaged by the dew and the dropped boxes. A pair of my work boots sat in the gutter, laces tangled together, soaked through from the sprinkler system that must have run that morning before Diane pulled everything outside. I remember bending down to pick them up and just holding them for a second, water soaking into my sleeves, feeling something close to disbelief that a person could do this to another person's belongings and still describe herself in a text message as simply protecting her investment. Marcus didn't say much while we loaded the truck. He'd shown up in his work coveralls, straight from the shop, grease still under his fingernails, and at one point he picked up a framed photo of our parents that had cracked down the middle when it hit the pavement and just stood there holding it for a moment before setting it carefully in the truck bed, corner up, the way you'd handle something at a funeral. I slept on his couch that night, staring at his ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark, replaying every single warning sign I had talked myself out of over the past 5 weeks. Jenna's warning about her cousin, the apologies that came fast and meant nothing, the small white device above my closet door frame that I hadn't thought about once since the day I moved in. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Paul Renner had a small practice off Wayne Avenue, and he read through everything I brought him, the texts, the photos of my belongings on the curb, the time-stamped messages, in about 20 minutes without saying a word. Then he set the folder down. "This is an illegal eviction," he said. "No notice, no court order, no cause. Ohio requires a formal eviction process through the courts, full stop. She can't just change your locks and put your things on the street because she felt like it. We're suing for $5,000, covering the deposit, damages, and statutory penalties." The moment we filed, 4 days later, Diane's texts started arriving in a way that felt less like anger and more like a woman unraveling in real time. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," the first one read. Then, 20 minutes later, "I'll bury you in court. Drop this now or you'll regret it." Then, that same night, close to midnight, "I've done this before, Daniel. I always win. Ask around." I didn't respond to any of them. I forwarded every single message to Paul, and he told me to keep doing exactly that and to stop reading them if I could help it, though I never quite managed to. For the next 2 weeks, I spent my evenings after work gathering everything I could find. Every text going back to the closet incident, every photo of the moved furniture, the opened mail, the empty garage, the belongings on the curb. Bank records showing my rent had been paid on time every single month. I built a folder an inch thick, and I walked into that courthouse on the morning of the hearing, sure, genuinely sure, that I had a case so clean it couldn't lose. That's when I saw her standing beside Grant Feld, holding that leather folder like a trophy, smiling the smile I told you about at the very beginning of all this. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. 3 days before that hearing, something happened that I didn't understand the full significance of until I was standing in that hallway with Feld's countersuit shaking slightly in Paul's hands. I had posted a short summary of my situation in a local Dayton renters forum, mostly venting, half hoping someone might recognize the address and back me up if I ever needed it. 2 days later, I got a message from a name I didn't recognize. Corey Thomas. "I rented 214 Larkspur before you," he wrote. 8 months, left in December. "I need to tell you something." We talked on the phone that night for almost an hour. Corey was 29, worked in IT support, and he told me he'd left the house abruptly after finding something he still didn't like discussing. During his final week there, replacing a light fixture in the bedroom closet, he'd found a small device tucked above the doorframe, wired into what looked like a modified smoke detector housing. Curious, he'd popped it open. Inside was a battery pack and a micro SD card slot. No smoke detection components at all, just a lens and a card. "I called the police," he told me. "They took a report. Nothing came of it. No card in the device by the time they looked at it. No proof of what it had recorded or when. Voss told them it was an old baby monitor component, left over from a grandkid visiting years back, still wired into the same housing by accident. They didn't have enough enough to charge her with anything. I moved out 2 days later and never told anyone else, because who was going to believe me without proof? I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, feeling something cold move slowly down my spine, because I remembered that exact device. The small white housing above my closet door frame, the one I'd photographed and texted her about on my second day in the house, the one she'd told me without hesitation was disconnected, not connected to anything anymore, she'd written. Ignore it. I called Paul first thing the next morning and told him everything Corey had said. Paul went quiet on the other end of the line for a second, then asked me to send him the original photo I'd taken of the device, along with Diane's text response calling it disconnected. If she shows up with video evidence from inside your bedroom, he said, I want to know exactly where that footage came from and when it was recorded, before she gets the chance to explain it away. That's what he was holding in his hand quietly, folded into his legal pad, when we walked into courtroom 4B that morning. Not just our case for the illegal eviction, a single, patient question, waiting for the right moment to be asked. Inside courtroom 4B, the bailiff called our case and Judge Elaine Whitfield took her seat at the bench, reading glasses perched low on her nose, a stack of case files already arranged in front of her. Paul presented our side first, methodical and unhurried. The illegal lockout, the photos of my belongings dumped on the curb like trash, the time-stamped texts giving me 1 hour to vacate a house I still had 8 months left on a lease for. The judge took notes as he spoke, nodding slowly, occasionally glancing up at Diane over the rim of her glasses. Then Grantfeld stood, buttoning his jacket, and reached for his tablet. Your Honor, my client has video evidence of extensive property damage caused by the tenant during his residency, he said, and turned the screen so the judge could see. Diane sat up a little straighter beside him, arms folded, radiating the same confidence she'd carried through the hallway that morning. I felt my stomach drop for the second time that day because I genuinely did not know what was on that screen, and for one disorienting moment I wondered if I'd somehow forgotten damaging a house I'd barely had time to live in. The judge studied the tablet screen for a long moment, her frown deepening. Where exactly is this damage? She asked. I don't see any holes in these walls. Diane leaned forward eagerly, like she'd been waiting for the question. The holes are hidden behind the posters, Your Honor. The tenant covered them up before he left. The holes are behind the posters, the judge repeated, flat. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't want to disturb his privacy by moving them myself, but they're there, underneath. The judge set the tablet down slowly on the bench in front of her. When exactly was this video recorded? While the tenant was still living there, Your Honor. I wanted documentation in case anything like this happened. Paul rose then, unhurried, and asked permission to approach. The judge nodded. He walked to the bench and set down 2 pieces of paper. The photo I'd taken of the white device above my closet frame, time-stamped my second day in the house. And beside it, Diane's own text message, time-stamped an hour later. Not connected to anything anymore. Ignore it. Your Honor, we'd like to enter this into evidence, Paul said. My client photographed this device on his second day of residency and was told, in writing by the landlord, that it was disconnected and non-functional. We believe it is the same device visible in the footage counsel just presented, and that it was, in fact, an active recording device installed inside my client's bedroom without his knowledge. The courtroom went very quiet. Grantfeld turned to look at his own client, and for the first time all morning, his easy composure cracked, just slightly, around the eyes. Judge Whitfield picked the photo up, then the text message, reading them both twice. Then she looked up, directly at Diane, and folded her hands on the bench in front of her. Her voice, when it came, stayed calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Mrs. Voss, you just told this court that you respect your tenant's privacy. So, I need to ask you something very simple, and I need you to answer it directly. Diane's confident little smile had started to falter. She glanced at Feld. He wouldn't look at her. Did you enter that bedroom and install a recording device and film that footage with the tenant's knowledge or permission? Yes or no? The entire courtroom went still. Paul sat frozen beside me, pen hovering over his legal pad. Diane's mouth opened. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the leather folder in her lap until her knuckles went pale and bloodless. She looked at the judge. She looked at Feld. She looked back at the judge, and she said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Judge Whitfield waited almost 15 full seconds, watching her before she spoke again. I'll take that as a no, she said. That's when Diane finally found her voice, and it came out wrong. Too fast, too high. Your Honor, I only installed that for security purposes. There had been break-ins on the street. I never intended to invade anyone's privacy. I just wanted to protect my property. Your property is the house, the judge said. That device was pointed at a bed inside a tenant's private bedroom. There is no security justification for that placement, Mrs. Voss, and I think you know it, given how quickly you tried to explain it away as a baby monitor when a different tenant found the same device and called the police on you 8 months ago. Diane's head snapped toward me at that, something raw and startled crossing her face, and for just a second, I watched her actually see me, maybe for the first time since I'd moved into her house, not as an inconvenience, not as a line item on a spreadsheet of properties she managed, as a person who had put the pieces together. This changes the posture of this case considerably, Judge Whitfield continued, addressing both attorneys now. I'm dismissing the countersuit in full, with prejudice. It appears to rely on footage that may itself constitute evidence of a crime, and I'm not inclined to reward that. As for the original claim, I'm fighting for the plaintiff on the illegal eviction. Full deposit return plus statutory damages, $5,000 total, and I'm referring the matter of the recording device to the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office for review, alongside the prior police report I expect counsel to locate and produce. Grantfeld stood very still for a moment, then quietly closed his leather folder and said, "Your Honor, may I request a brief recess to confer with my client?" "You may," the judge said, "though I'd encourage you to confer about more than just this case." Diane didn't move right away. She sat at the defense table, staring at nothing, the folder that had walked in like a trophy now sitting closed and useless in front of her. I felt Paul's hand land briefly on my shoulder, and I realized my own hands were shaking, not from fear anymore, but from something that felt like the floor finally leveling out beneath me after 5 months of tilting. I looked over at her one more time before Paul steered me toward the door. She was still sitting there, very small in her chair, and for the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't smiling at all. Grantfeld withdrew as her attorney 6 days later. I heard about it from Paul, who'd heard it from a clerk at the courthouse who knew someone in Feld's office. He didn't give a public reason, but Paul said it wasn't hard to guess. No lawyer wants their name attached to a client who just handed a judge evidence of a potential felony in open court, especially not a lawyer who was standing right next to her when she did it, nodding along, not knowing what was coming. Diane hired a new attorney within the week, a heavy-set man named Robert Kessler who specialized, according to his website, in aggressive landlord representation. I don't think aggressive representation was going to be enough this time. Detective Naomi Ortiz from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office called me on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the hearing, and asked if I'd be willing to come in and give a formal statement about the device, the timeline, and my communications with Diane about it. I said yes before she'd even finished the sentence. Sitting in that interview room, I watched Detective Ortiz lay out a folder of her own, thinner than the one Diane had carried into court, but heavier in a different way. She told me carefully that Corey Thomas's original 2023 police report had never been fully closed. It had been marked inactive due to lack of evidence, sitting in a digital filing cabinet somewhere, waiting for exactly the kind of corroborating detail my case had just handed them. My photo, my text message, the judge's referral. Suddenly, a report that had gone nowhere for 8 months had somewhere to go. "We're also looking into whether other tenants at her other properties may have experienced something similar," Ortiz told me. "Given the pattern, I'd be surprised if this was isolated to 2 houses." She asked me a series of careful, methodical questions after that, the kind that made me realize how differently a trained investigator thinks about a timeline compared to how I'd lived through it. Not just what happened, but when I'd first mentioned the device to Diane, what her exact wording had been, whether I still had the original photo file with its metadata intact rather than just a screenshot. I did, thankfully, still have it on my phone, untouched since the day I took it. She had me forward it to her directly from the device itself, watching the transfer complete before thanking me and closing her notebook. "For what it's worth," she said, walking me out, "cases like this usually stall because the first person who reports it doesn't have documentation, and the second person who reports it doesn't know the first person exists. You two finding each other online is honestly the reason any of this is moving at all." She shook my hand at the door, a firm, business-like grip, and added one more thing before I left. "Keep documenting everything going forward, too. Old habits like that don't have to be a burden forever. Sometimes they're just good practice." I thought about that on the drive home, how close the whole thing had come to going nowhere. If I hadn't posted in that forum, if Corey hadn't happened to see it, if I hadn't, on a whim, texted Diane a photo of a device I could have just as easily ignored entirely on my second day in the house. She was right to be surprised because it wasn't. Within 3 weeks of the hearing, a local news station picked up the story, a short segment buried in the evening broadcast about a Dayton landlord under investigation for hidden recording devices in rental properties. I didn't do the interview. I wasn't ready for that kind of exposure yet. But Corey did, sitting in silhouette, his voice altered, telling a version of the story that finally had somewhere real to land. Within 4 days of that segment airing, 2 more former tenants came forward. A woman named Renata Suarez, who had rented Diane's Delridge property, Jenna's cousin Priya's old building 2 years before Priya lived there, and a man in his 60s named Harold Bly, who had rented a different property on Iroquois Trail for almost 3 years before moving into assisted living. Renata's story ran almost parallel to mine, in a way that unsettled me when I first read it. She'd rented the Delridge property for 14 months, and during that time she'd noticed small things she'd chalked up to her own forgetfulness. A lamp moved a few inches, a drawer she was sure she'd left closed, sitting open when she got home. She told the reporter she'd started keeping a mental log, without even realizing that's what she was doing. The same instinct I'd developed without naming it, the low hum of doubting your own memory in a space that was supposed to be the one place you didn't have to. She'd moved out at the end of her lease rather than renew, telling Diane it was for a job relocation that didn't actually exist, because some part of her, she said, hadn't trusted her own instincts enough to name what she actually suspected. Reading that felt like reading a version of my own story with the ending changed, the one where I'd quietly slipped away instead of digging in, and I don't know, honestly, whether that version would have been easier or simply would have let Diane keep going a while longer with someone else. Harold's account was the one that stuck with me longest, maybe because he was older, maybe because he described finding a similar device behind a bathroom vent, not a bedroom, and had assumed for years it was simply an old ventilation fan motor he'd never bothered to ask about. He told the reporter, in a shaky but steady voice, that he didn't feel angry so much as violated in a way he was still trying to find language for. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to. Diane's family started to fracture publicly around the same time. She had a son, Ryan Voss, 34, who had occasionally helped her manage maintenance requests across the 6 properties. Ryan issued a short statement to the same news station, distancing himself entirely, saying he had never known about any recording devices and had cut off contact with his mother once the allegations became public. I don't know if that was true or if it was damage control. I only know that whatever family unity Diane had once projected during our lease walkthrough, the picture of her and Walter building something together over 30 years was gone within a month, replaced by silence from her own son and a sister, Carol Ann Voss Hendricks, who I later learned had quietly reached out to Paul's office offering to testify about Diane's behavior toward tenants over the years. Off the record at first, then on it, once the case moved forward. Carol Ann told Paul that she had warned Diane more than once after Walter died that she was, in Carol Ann's words, holding on to those houses like they were the only piece of him left and treating the people living in them like intruders in a marriage that had already ended. Carol Ann and I spoke on the phone once, briefly, in late May. She didn't ask for anything from me, and she was careful not to make excuses for her sister, but she wanted me to know, she said, that she'd tried. She described a Thanksgiving 2 years earlier where she'd sat Diane down and told her plainly that the properties were becoming a substitute for grief work. Diane refused to do any other way, that watching over tenants like they were extensions of a marriage that no longer existed wasn't healthy for anyone involved. Diane had thrown a serving spoon into the sink hard enough to chip it and told her sister to mind her own business. Carol Ann never brought it up again, until my case gave her a reason to. I should have said something sooner to somebody, she told me. I kept thinking it was a family problem, not a legal one. I was wrong about that, clearly. I'm sorry it took this long, and I'm sorry it took you specifically going through it for anyone to finally do anything. I told her I didn't blame her. I meant it. It's easy, from the outside, looking at a story already resolved, to ask why nobody stepped in sooner. It's harder, living inside a family, to see a pattern clearly enough to name it before it costs someone something as concrete as a stolen bike or a hidden camera. I've stopped assigning blame to the people standing on the edges of situations like mine. There's only room, I've found, for so much of that before it curdles into something that doesn't actually help anyone heal. That detail sat with me for a long time. It didn't make what she did to me acceptable. Nothing could. But it gave her actions a shape I hadn't expected. Something sadder and more human than the cartoonish, money-grubbing landlord I'd built up in my head during those angry, sleepless weeks on Marcus's couch. She wasn't a monster who woke up each morning plotting cruelty. She was a grieving, controlling woman who had convinced herself that watching over her tenants, in every sense of that word, was the same thing as protecting what she and Walter had built. That conviction didn't make her less dangerous. If anything, it made her more dangerous, because she believed completely that she was the reasonable one in every single interaction we ever had. The financial fallout came fast once the news segment aired. 2 of her remaining tenants at other properties terminated their leases early, citing the ongoing investigation and a reasonable, understandable fear about what might be hidden in their own walls. A property management review site I found by accident, searching her name late one night when I couldn't sleep, filled up with a dozen new 1-star reviews within a week, most of them from names I didn't recognize, a few clearly from people who'd simply heard the story and wanted to add their disgust to the record, even without a personal connection to it. Her Wayne Avenue rental license came under review by the city's housing authority, and by early summer, 3 of her 6 properties sat empty, unrentable in practice, even if not officially condemned, because nobody in Dayton wanted to be the next name in that story. Diane tried to reach me directly twice during that stretch, both times through channels that felt almost desperate compared to the cold confidence she'd carried into the courthouse. The first was a letter, handwritten, mailed to my new address before I'd even told anyone my new address, which meant she'd either kept old paperwork with a forwarding request attached or gone looking for it herself. In it, she wrote that she hoped I understood none of it had been personal, that she'd simply been trying to protect what she and Walter had spent 30 years building, and that she hoped, when everything settled, I might consider telling the prosecutor I didn't wish to pursue charges. I didn't respond. I gave the letter to Paul, who photographed it and added it to the file, and told me gently that reaching out to a victim during an active investigation, even indirectly, wasn't going to help her case if anyone in the prosecutor's office found out about it. The second attempt came in June, a voicemail left on my cell phone at 11:40 at night, her voice thinner than I remembered it, almost unrecognizable from the woman who had once laughed in my face over a release clause. She said she'd lost 2 more tenants that week. She said Ryan wouldn't return her calls. She said she didn't know how she was going to keep up with the mortgage payments on properties that were sitting empty, and that all of it, had started over some furniture and a bike. And didn't I think that was excessive? Didn't I think a felony charge was excessive for a woman who'd never actually hurt anyone? I listened to that voicemail 3 times before I deleted it. Some part of me almost felt the pull of it, the old familiar instinct to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, the same instinct that had let her back into my life again and again after every apology in the early weeks of the lease. I recognized that pull for what it was this time, and I let the voicemail go without calling back. Whatever she was going through by that point, and I don't doubt it was real, it didn't erase what had been recorded above my closet door, and it wasn't my job to manage her consequences for her, the way it had never actually been my job to manage her water heater emergencies, or her grief over Walter, or her fear of financial instability, no matter how many times she tried to make those things my responsibility during the 5 weeks I lived in her house. I want to be honest about something because these stories usually skip past it in favor of a clean, satisfying ending, and I don't think that's fair to anyone actually living through something like this. Winning didn't feel like winning. Not entirely. Not right away. I moved my things into Marcus's spare room for 6 weeks while I found a new place, and during that time, I noticed I'd started doing something I'd never done before. I checked light fixtures. I checked smoke detectors. I unscrewed a bathroom vent cover in Marcus's house one night at 11 o'clock, flashlight in my teeth just to look, and found nothing but dust and a spider's nest, and still felt my hands shaking afterward. There was a night in early May, about 3 weeks after the hearing, when I sat on the edge of Marcus's guest bed and let myself grieve something I hadn't expected to grieve. Not Diane, not the house. I grieved the version of moving out on my own that I'd pictured back in February, the version where I finally had a door only I had a key to, a place that felt entirely mine, quiet and unwatched. I never got that version. What I got instead was 5 weeks of a stranger walking through my life whenever she decided to, followed by 5 months of proving in a courtroom that it had actually happened. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the specific simple joy I thought renting my first place would give me got lost, and I don't think I ever fully got it back, not the way it existed in my head before any of this started. Marcus understood that better than anyone. He didn't try to talk me out of the feeling or rush me toward gratitude for how the case had turned out. He just sat with me some nights, watching whatever game was on, not saying much, letting the quiet do the work that words couldn't. Jenna, at the warehouse, started quietly checking in on me every few days without making a thing of it, and told me once, over a break room coffee, that she felt guilty for not pushing harder when she first warned me about Priya's experience. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "I heard you. I just didn't want it to be true." Corey Thomas became someone I talked to almost weekly through the rest of that spring and into summer. First about the case, then about things that had nothing to do with Diane at all. We met for coffee near his office downtown in June, the two of us sitting across from each other, comparing notes like survivors of something neither of us had fully named yet. He told me he'd started therapy after the police report went nowhere the first time back in December because he needed somewhere to put the specific low-grade dread of not being believed. I told him I understood that more now than I had a month earlier. By July, the Montgomery County Prosecutor's Office had formally charged Diane with voyeurism and unauthorized interception of communications, felony counts tied to my case and Corey's, with Renata's and Harold's accounts filed as supporting pattern evidence, even though the statute of limitations complicated whether those two incidents could be charged directly. Paul told me the case would likely take the better part of a year to resolve, given how these things move, and he was right. I'm writing this now with all of it still technically pending, a court date scheduled for next spring, though her attorney has reportedly opened conversations about a plea agreement rather than risk a jury seeing that courtroom video and photos side by side the way Judge Whitfield had. The $5,000 from the civil judgment came through in August, direct deposit, a strange and almost anticlimactic number to watch appear in my account after everything it represented. I used part of it for first and last month's rent on a new place. I used another part of it, smaller, almost symbolic, to buy a replacement bike, the exact same model as the one that had disappeared through an open garage door back in April. I don't know why that felt important to do. It just did. I rode it the first weekend I owned it along the same bike path near the River Marcus, and I used to take as kids, and somewhere around the second mile, without deciding to, I started laughing, not because anything was funny, just because my body needed somewhere to put the feeling that had been sitting in my chest for 5 months with nowhere else to go. There were complications along the way that don't fit neatly into a story like this, but that took up real space in my life at the time. Diane's original insurance company, once notified of the criminal referral, opened its own liability review, which meant a separate set of forms, a separate set of calls, a claims adjuster named Denise who phoned me twice, asking me to describe in detail exactly what had been damaged or lost, as though the emotional weight of finding a hidden camera above your closet could be itemized the same way as a stolen bike. I answered her questions as patiently as I could each time, mostly because Paul told me it mattered for how the eventual eventual settlement, if there was one beyond the court judgment, might be structured. There was also a strange, small complication with my old collections debt, the $600 from the ER visit that Diane had used against me after opening my mail. In an unexpected twist, the additional funds I set aside from the judgment let me pay off the remaining balance in full that same August, closing out something that had quietly followed me around for 2 years. I remember sitting at my kitchen table in my new apartment, confirmation email open on my laptop, feeling an odd, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with Diane at all. It was just mine. A small, boring, adult thing I'd finally finished, on my own terms, in my own time. Finding that new apartment took longer than I expected, not because good places were scarce, but because I had become, almost overnight, an extremely careful renter. I asked every landlord I met with about entry policies, notice requirements, whether the property used any smart devices for security, and where exactly they were installed. Most of them looked at me a little strangely until I gave them the short version of why I was asking, and then, almost every time, their expression shifted into something more careful, more respectful. One landlord, an older man named Frank Delgado, who managed a small fourplex near the university, told me flatly that he'd read about Diane's case in the paper. Small city, he said. Word travels. I'll tell you right now, I've never once entered a unit without 24 hours notice in 11 years of doing this, and I'm not about to start. You can ask my current tenants yourself. I did ask them. 2 of them, an older couple in the unit below the one I eventually rented, told me Frank was, in their words, boring and predictable in exactly the way you want a landlord to be. I signed that lease in September, 6 months almost to the day since I'd signed the one with Diane, and this time I read every clause twice, and then I read it a third time out loud to Marcus over the phone, just to be sure. Frank laughed a little when I asked him to initial an extra line I'd added myself, spelling out the 24-hour notice requirement in language even more specific than what Ohio law technically required, but he signed it without complaint and told me some tenants he'd rather lose than argue with over something that basic. I remember driving home from his office that afternoon feeling, for the first time in months, like the ground under a lease agreement could actually hold my weight. It's been a little over a year since that morning in the courthouse hallway, since I watched Diane Voss walk toward us holding that tablet like it already held the verdict inside it. I still think about that walk sometimes, the clean confidence in it, the way she genuinely believed she had already won before anyone had said a single word inside that courtroom. I think about it because I understand now that her confidence wasn't performance. She believed it completely. She believed it the same way she believed she was allowed to walk into my bedroom without notice. The same way she believed opening my mail was a form of care rather than a violation. The same way she believed a camera above a closet door was protection rather than intrusion. Every single thing she did to me, she had a story ready to explain, and the stories were never entirely lies. They were worse than lies in a way. They were a kind of belief so total it left no room for anyone else's reality to exist alongside it. Her criminal case is still moving through the system as I put this into words. Paul tells me the plea negotiations are ongoing, that her new attorney is trying to keep her out of a jury box that would eventually see the photo of that white device and her own text message, side by side, the way Judge Whitfield saw them. Whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever sentence or settlement eventually gets attached to her name, I've stopped waiting for it to feel like closure. I used to think there would be a specific moment, a verdict read aloud, a number on a piece of paper, that would finally let the whole thing exhale out of my chest. It hasn't worked that way. Closure, I've learned, isn't a single moment handed to you by a judge. It's something you build slowly, in small, unglamorous pieces, the same way you'd rebuild trust in a person who hurt you, except this time, the person is yourself, and the trust is in your own ability to tell when a place is actually safe. My apartment now is smaller than the Larkspur Lane house, 1 bedroom instead of 2, no backyard, just a narrow balcony that looks out over a parking lot, and past that, a stand of sycamore trees that turn a genuinely beautiful gold every October. Frank still hasn't set foot inside without texting first, every single time, even for things as minor as leaving a package he could have just left at the door. I noticed that the first month and mentioned it to him once, almost as a joke, and he told me, seriously, that he'd rather annoy a tenant with too many texts than ever be the reason someone felt what I must have felt standing in that driveway, looking at everything I owned stacked on the curb. I didn't expect that kind of acknowledgement from a stranger, and it meant more than he probably realized. Marcus and I still watch the game together most Sundays, though now it's at my place instead of his, which feels like its own small, quiet victory, having somewhere of my own worth inviting people back into. Jenna and I still work the same shift at Fenmore, and she brought Priya by one weekend this past spring to finally meet me in person, the 2 of them sitting on my balcony with the sycamores turning green outside. Priya telling her own version of what it had been like renting from Diane 2 years before any of this became public. It turned out her story included a version of the mail thing too, a different kind of leverage, a different vulnerability Diane had found and pressed on. Hearing it confirmed something I'd already started to understand. This was never really about me specifically. I was simply the tenant whose case happened to break the the pattern open into daylight. Corey and I still get coffee most months. He moved in with his girlfriend last winter, a row house near the Oregon district, and he told me recently that he still checks vents and fixtures sometimes, an old habit that's softened but never fully gone. I told him I understood because mine hasn't fully gone either. I don't think it's supposed to. I think some part of you that learns to watch for danger in a place that's supposed to be safe simply stays a little more watchful after that, permanently. The way a hand that's been burned once moves differently near a stove for the rest of its life, even long after the burn itself has healed. I think about Harold Bly sometimes too, the man in his 60s who found a device behind a bathroom vent and spent years assuming it was nothing more than an old fan motor. I never met him in person, only read his account in that first news segment, and later, briefly, in a follow-up piece the paper ran once charges were formally filed. I think about how many years he lived in that house believing he was simply careful and private by nature, never suspecting that some of what he thought was his own instinct for privacy had actually been shaped by something watching him the entire time. I hope, wherever he is now, that he's found a version of quiet that actually belongs to him, the kind that doesn't have to be double-checked behind a vent cover before it can be trusted. Work has changed too, in small ways I didn't expect. Fenmore promoted me to full shift manager that October, a role I'd been circling for almost a year before any of this started, and I sometimes wonder if the version of me who existed before Larkspur Lane would have handled that promotion differently, more casually, less aware of how much steadiness matters when you're responsible for other people's routines. I run my shift the way Frank runs his fourplex now, I think. Predictable, transparent, no surprises sprung on anyone who didn't ask for them. It's a strange, indirect gift to take from something so painful, but I don't think I fully understood the value of consistency until I lived 5 weeks without any. I went back to Larkspur Lane once in September, almost by accident, taking a different route home from a hardware store across town. The house sat there behind its overgrown hedge, a real estate sign staked crookedly in the front yard, one of the 3 properties the city's housing review had effectively frozen. I didn't get out of the car. I sat at the curb for maybe 90 seconds, engine idling, looking at the same porch steps Marcus and I had hauled boxes up 7 months earlier, the same window I used to see lit from the driveway when I came home from a late shift, and I felt less than I expected to feel. Not nothing, but less. It had become, somehow, just a house again, empty and unremarkable, no longer the stage for the worst 5 weeks of my adult life. I drove home after that and didn't think about going back a second time. If there's a single thing I've taken from all of this, past the money, past the outcome of the case, past even the strange, unlikely friendships that grew out of something so ugly, it's this. A home is not 4 walls and a lease with your name on it. A home is the specific, quiet certainty that no one is watching you inside it. I didn't understand how fragile that certainty was until someone took it from me, one small violation at a time, each one small enough on its own to explain away, until the sum of them became something I couldn't explain away at all. Diane Voss walked into that courtroom smiling, certain she had already won, holding a tablet full of evidence she believed would bury me the same way she'd buried every warning sign, every apology, every quiet, reasonable request I'd ever made of her. She was wrong about the tablet. She was wrong about the case. But some nights, when I'm checking a light fixture in my own apartment for no real reason at all, just an old habit that hasn't worn off yet, I think about the fact that she wasn't entirely wrong about one thing. Something really was taken from me in that house on Larkspur Lane, and no verdict. No $5,000, no felony charge pending in a courtroom next spring is ever going to hand it fully back. I have a good life now, a door only I have a key to, friends who checked in when it mattered and stayed after it didn't matter anymore. But I still remember, more clearly than I'd like to, exactly what it felt like to stand on that sidewalk and realize the place I thought was mine had never really been mine at all, and some part of me will probably spend the rest of my life making sure I never let that happen again.